Hello. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm Professor James Wilson from the Philosophy Department. I wanted to welcome you to this final week of Inspiring Minds. Now, much of my research is about what you can learn from stories. I'm particularly interested about the kinds of narratives people tell about their illnesses. Some of that will come up later today in the discussion of John Berger. I'm aware that for some of you, this will be the first event that you've come to in the season. Other people will probably be old hands already. You may even come to every single one of these sessions. We have a code name for those people. We call them the ultra elite group. These people are the immortals who come to every single session. You may be one of them. If so, welcome again. I'll say a little bit more about Inspiring Minds in general. Then I'll say a bit more about this, our final week. I've called it Imagining Better Futures, before saying a little bit by way of introduction to the John Berger essay, Go Ask the Time, which we'll be talking about later today. So, why was it that we put on this Inspiring Minds season? Well, it's easy when you start university, or even as you continue it, or even perhaps as you become a lecturer, to end up sticking rigidly within your own discipline and your own department. This can lead to a certain narrowness. You become very good at using certain sorts of tools for understanding the world, while perhaps becoming increasingly blind to the fact that these aren't the only tools, the only ways of understanding the world. So the different weeks of Inspiring Minds have been very much about the power and the value of listening and speaking across boundaries. And all of us who've been organizing these talks have been driven by the idea that interdisciplinary thinking in the arts and humanities is necessary to help us challenge some of the most pressing problems we face, whether it's questions to do with race or gender or climate crisis, or even the rise of the information society. This week, Imagining Better Futures focuses on thinking about the future from an interdisciplinary humanities perspective. How can we think more rigorously and more imaginatively about the future? So the week's partly inspired by the kind of circumstances we find ourselves in as a result of the pandemic, but it looks more broadly and more deeply than that. So, of course, the pandemic so far has brought into focus long-existing systemic injustices faced by vulnerable groups. We've seen how difficult it can be to overcome those inequities, even where the political will to do so exists. But it's also given us some grounds for hope that radical and rapid change is possible. States have built new hospitals within days and taken swift action on a massive scale to control the spread of the virus. Nonetheless, despite the fact that possibilities seem to be shifting, I think it's probably still quite early to start thinking seriously about what the world is going to look like after COVID. Some of our politicians have repeatedly told us that we're near the end, but the end point has been consistently deferred and then deferred again. We may still be nearer the beginning than the end of the crisis, I fear, and it's difficult to draw lessons from a crisis when you're still in the middle of it. So, in thinking about this week, I thought it was really important to be able to think more broadly and more deeply about the future. Now, the lack of ability to predict the future, which we've seen from the way in which, for example, Boris Johnson has addressed it, is just one of a very large number of examples of the ways in which it turns out that we human beings are often rather less good at predicting the future than we think we are. In fact, if you look back into the past about some of either the science fiction or the kind of predictions that technologists have made, you can see that actually it's probably more common rather than rare that extremely smart people tend to just be really bad at thinking about the future. So the future of the history of technology is littered with people who should have known better, not really understanding the implications of a transformative technology. To give you just a flavor, so the telephone was initially rubbished by the British Post Office on the grounds, and I quote, "The Americans have need of the telephone, but we do not. We have plenty of messenger boys." Meanwhile, in 1903, the president of Michigan Savings Bank advised Henry Ford's lawyer not to invest in the Ford Motor Company, saying that the horse is here to stay, but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad. Later, Ken Olsen, who was the founder of the Digital Equipment Corporation, then one of the largest computer companies in the world, said in 1977, "There's no reason that anyone would want a computer in their home." And finally, Steve Chen, the chief technical officer and co-founder of YouTube, expressed concern in 2005 about his company's long-term future, saying, There's just not that many videos I want to watch. And it's not just bad tech predictions. Precious few foresaw the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and few foresaw the way in which social media and a host of other changes would install strongmen, populist leaders, and a variety of formerly well-functioning democracies. So I think that any attempt to think rigorously about creating better futures needs to be alive to the possibility, and indeed the likelihood, that we may be wrong about the way things are going to turn out. Just as people in the past have made obvious mistakes, so we're likely to make obvious mistakes as well. So I think that part of thinking intelligently about the future is lucidly acknowledging the ways in which it's difficult to think within the confines of our existing traditions, and the ways in which our preconceptions tend to make it difficult to see things that go beyond our fundamental expectations. I think that examining the nature of our experience of time and of what counts as progress is central for thinking better about the future. Today's reading group focuses on the lived experience of time by thinking about themes like eternity, storytelling, and what makes a life meaningful. Tomorrow, we have a virtual film screening and panel discussion inspired by themes from Denis Villeneuve's movie Arrival. This story focuses on a field linguist who's charged with learning how to communicate with some mysterious 7-footed alien creatures, heptapods, who arrive on Earth unannounced. As initial attempts to communicate with the heptapods become more successful, it becomes apparent that their language is structured by their lived experience of time and space, just as our human embodiment shapes our worlds. And that, as we'll discuss tomorrow, seeing the world from a completely different perspective may raise questions about time, free will, and the purpose of our own lives. And the last event is on Thursday. It's all about the role of the arts and humanities in imagining a better future. We'll look at and celebrate the role and ability of arts and humanities to do what other disciplines and ways of thinking about the world can't. And also think about what role the humanities should play in a university and what role they should play in politics. I'll say a little bit by way of introduction to John Berger. Now, John Berger is an amazing figure, and he died 2 years ago, but over an extraordinarily long career, he was an art critic, essayist, poet, novelist, cultural commentator, polemicist, and much, much more, artist and so on. But if there's one theme that you could pick out from his work, is about the importance and the meaning of attending really closely to things. Now, over the course of his career, he attended very closely to artworks, to human suffering, to all sorts of things, to the nature of peasant labor, but that he thought that there's a value in seeing things as they are, in attesting to them and putting them in clear prose so that people can understand that. And he thought that had not only a personal meaning, but a political meaning as well. So the essay that we're going to read today starts from a story about a man who doesn't want to die. He goes away from his family seeking immortality. So he first meets someone who tells him he can live to 100 if he stays with him. That doesn't seem enough. He meets another man who says he can live to 200 if he sticks with him. Then he meets another man who says that he'll live to 300 if he sticks with him. But he says that none of these are enough, and he goes on walking until he meets a man in a castle who says that if he sticks in the castle, he'll never die. Time passes, and he either becomes bored or a bit nostalgic for everything he used to know. So he begins his journey back and finds all those who told him that they could have 100 years or 200 years or 300 years of life have all died. Everything is transformed, and he doesn't recognize his own hometown anymore. He returns back to the castle, and as he's nearly back, he stops to help someone whose cart is stuck in the mud. This turns out to be Death, who's been chasing him all the time, and he dies instantly. Like much that's in the essay, this story has a strange and resonant quality, raising questions about the relationship between the length and the quality of a life, and in particular, what it is to spend the time that we have on the earth well. It's long been recognized that having a longer life is not necessarily a good thing. A life that goes on much longer but gradually becomes worse, with more pain, illness, and loneliness, is something that many people fear. The ancient Greek myth of Tithonus a mortal whom Eos, the goddess of the dawn, fell in love with, illustrates this. So Eos asked Zeus, the king of the gods, to make Tithonus immortal, but she forgot to ask for him to have boundless youth. And so, according to the myth, Tithonus lives on, unable to die, but gradually becoming frailer and cursing his life. Much of Berger's piece has Berger wrestling with an attempt to reconcile two different ways of interacting with and conceptualizing time. First, there's what we can call clock time, where events occur in a particular inexorable sequence. Time marches on, incurable diseases get worse, and we all die. Second, there's a subjective time, or time as we experience it. Subjectively, time can seem to go faster or slower. This is well enough known that it's proverbial. For example, people say that a watched pot never boils, and time flies when you're having fun. Importantly, we can alter our experience of subjective time through the kinds of narratives and stories we tell, and as we shape our experience of time. Berger suggests that we're the only animal which has these two modes of time. Animals are subject to clock time and live within it, but they have no conscious temporality as human beings do. And so the experience of time doesn't become a problem for them. We not only have to live in time, but also need to come to terms with our relationship to time and wrestle with the problems that this brings with it. It's only once we begin to notice this and see that different societies and different individuals solve these problems of temporal consciousness in different ways that we begin to see Berger's problem. Our solutions to them are often so basic that they're invisible until we compare them with practices from other times or other places. So, about 15 years ago, for various reasons, my dad was asked to translate the first Harry Potter novel into ancient Greek. And one of the biggest challenges, here it is for anybody who wants to buy it, one of the biggest challenges he faced, alongside trying to find ancient Greek equivalents of words like train, was the fact he realized that the ancient Greeks had a completely different sense of time from us. So that they just didn't have any precise ways of referring to time, so that you look at the old texts and they're full of things like, when they do refer to time, they say things like, at about the time the marketplace begins to fill up, or about the time the oxen head home from pasture. They never had the need to say anything like 4:53 p.m. or that something happened 5 minutes after something else. And so Berger's essay asks a question that we need to reflect on. What does our society's time consciousness say about us, about what it's like to live in our society? And that, in fact, if you dig a bit further into the history, you begin to see that quite a lot of our modern time consciousness is a product of the Industrial Revolution and of mechanization. Pre-Industrial Revolution, when people mostly lived together as families of artisans, and before the railways, there wasn't really the need for individuals to specify time precisely, or to be able to discipline themselves in and through time. So Berger's work is in part also a way of trying to draw attention to conceptions of temporality that have been lost. So for Berger, time is a matter of personal, even spiritual significance, but it's also political. He likes to draw attention to the ways in which certain ideas of progress, and in particular ideas of progress that aim to undercut traditional communities away from their moorings and away from things like the cycles introduced by the seasons and the rhythms of the body, the ways in which that can evolve a certain kind of violence, perhaps metaphorical, but sometimes literal violence imposed on people. And so it's important to notice that there's a poem right at the end of the piece, which is about a friend of Berger's who was murdered by the Chilean Pinochet regime. And in interpreting that story, it's important to reflect on the fact that Pinochet's Chile was in many ways the birthplace of what later became known as neoliberalism, and that the torture and the disappearances that the regime brought were part of the same policy framework that restructured the state through privatization and the shrinking of the state, and that many of the same individuals who advised on the economic reforms later on went on to advise President Reagan in the US. So the poem perhaps could be seen not just as a commemoration of a person, but a reflection on what's lost when certain kinds of experience of community and tradition and temporality are lost. poem does this in part through the way that it asks us to think about time, a time of commemoration that brings everything into a kind of timeless eternity, in which, in Berger's words, it emphasizes simultaneity instead of sequence, presence instead of cause and effect, ubiquity instead of identity. Now, I think it's a fascinating essay. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you in the next half hour or so in the breakout groups. And after we've done the breakout groups, we'll come back for a plenary discussion, so that if there's any questions you'd like to ask, either ask them in the discussion group, or we can discuss those questions when we come back. So thank you very much indeed, and we shall move to the breakout groups. Great, that should be everyone back. And so what I thought we might do for the remainder of the time is just to hear a bit from each of the groups about some of the discussions they had, some of the main themes or things that they wanted to share with us and for further discussion. So that from my group, I think that Jonathan was going to sort of give a brief report, and then I'll pass on to, well, either to Jennifer and Natasha can either sort of report back themselves or maybe suggest who they were going to nominate from their group. So yeah, so would you say a little bit, Jonathan?
Okay, so we had a very good discussion. We started off the discussion by focusing on the two stories at the start, and considering the similarities and differences between them, because at the end of the second story, Berger comments on, for all their difference of style, the two stories have something in common. So we were trying to unpack that a bit. In the first story, we focused on the presentation, or this idea of eternal life, and whether that's something we discussed whether that's something that we personally would seek. I think we were all in agreement that it seemed a bit odd that this young man has estranged himself from his family and all sort of human connections in this pursuit for eternal life. We thought that seemed a bit sort of fruitless. And on the surface, it seems very different from the second story, in which someone's life is shortened, and they, at the end of the story, we see them trying to make the most of that life. But we considered what these similarities were, and we sort of came to the conclusion that in both stories, the protagonists tried to break out of linear time, and while one's searching for eternal life and breaking out of the sort of fixed time frame that we have of our life, the other one, in the second story, the characters are immersing themselves so fully in the moment, in the event, that they transcend and break out of this sort of fixed time that we have. And then we consider the sort of second part of the essay, the more essay part of it, and discuss this sort of tension between the temporal and the eternal, which is something that Berger brings up in relation to time, time of the body, time of the soul, or time of the mind, he mentions, but also how this applies to storytelling, which is clearly quite a pertinent issue for Berger. And we related this to Charles Baudelaire, who in his essay, The Painter of Modern Life, discusses how the modern artist must find this balance between the temporal and the eternal, between something that's very specific to the now and something that resonates more fully to everyone. And James brought up an interesting discussion on YouTube somewhere between Susan Sontag and John Berger, in which they discuss the nature of storytelling, with Berger seeming to assume that all stories need to be fixed or need to be universal, whereas Sontag suggesting that this isn't necessarily the case, and that writing, the example I think James said that she gives is about the AIDS pandemic, and how writing about that specific context is very important in its own right. So we considered this idea that the nature of art, be that literature or painting, as Berger brings up with the Rembrandt painting, how there is there's similar tension to the tension in all of us between these two forms of time, and how art can maybe be a way of articulating that or presenting that tension and trying to work through that tension.
Thank you very much indeed. And so could I ask either Natasha or Jennifer's group, who was going to report back from those?
I can maybe summarize the main points, and then others can chip in. I think that the main thread that was running through all of our discussions is, so you talked about clock time and subjective time, and I think we were discussing relational time, really. I think that was the common theme, how we started off by talking about experiences of the pandemic, and how it's for some people been a sort of black hole of time. Has time gone in instances, it's stretched out to eternity? And Chris was pointing out how for some people this is not, there's a lot of talk of this being an unprecedented time and exceptional. And we were talking about how for some people this is how time is. We were talking about sort of loneliness and aloneness, or people kind of introverts, or people, who might have often liked spending a lot of time by themselves. So just thinking a bit about whether this has been a time of continuity for some people, and actually other people have sort of joined them in their version of time. I think Chris said something like, oh, welcome to, some people might say welcome to our world. We're talking about people with anxiety, also feeling a sort of shared experience in the moment of the pandemic. And then Tim was kind of connecting welcome to our world with welcome to our time. Is this a welcome to our time? This is how we experience time. So then the connection from that, thinking about loneliness versus aloneness, and whether you have choice in how you spend your time, sort of connected with some of the ideas of free will, and whether you would choose a day of absolute freedom versus an eternity in confinement. And Safi was talking about the sort of terror, the terror of in existentialist thought of complete free will, and the complete freedom. And then I think, we sort of moved on. Well, we talked a little bit about about in the painting, that sort of relationality that's presented in the Rembrandt painting, how experiences of time might change depending on who you're spending your time with. So that, again, that was the relational time. But we had a really interesting sort of end to our conversation, I think, thinking a bit about whether culture, poetry, photography, about whether culture is sort of resists these linear visions of time, talking about Pinochet's vision of time, for example, about inexorable kind of progress, economic expansion, privatization, etc., and what poetry and what different art forms can do to resist those logics, these logics of time as violence. And we were just talking a little bit about how cultural creations might multiply, and narratives might multiply stories of different lives in a way that certain regimes might be trying to cut them short. And we were sort of connecting to some discussions in other weeks about, the deaths of environmental activists, or we also connected it to some of the discussions about the Tower of Babel, the Biblioteca de Babel, the Borges story, and what can be glimpsed beyond our sort of mastery of time and mastery of the universe, and the sort of hubris of that. We had a lot of conversation. I don't know if I've captured everything, because it was really rich, and a lot of different personal perspectives as well. I don't know if any of the others want to come in.
I think you've done a brilliant job there, Natasha. Do Chris or Leodor or Safi, do you want to come in and add to amplify what Natasha said? I've chucked some stuff in the chat that actually came out of our discussion as well. So,
Well, it's interesting in the Pinochet poem, and I think you copied this line down in the chat, Tim. It says, he endured the time without seasons, which belonged to the torturers. And that's so interesting, because it seems as if sort of the radical who is killed, sort of like his actual physical time on Earth is cut short, but it's only through that process that he's then able to sort of kind of transcend time, transcend everything, and sort of be everywhere at once, which is sort of interesting. Sort of I need to go back to the text, but he's sort of described as being there and at one with all the other natural elements, which is really quite interesting. And I guess that sort of, you could link that back to the photograph with the soldier and his wife, sort of. There's something innate within the human being which transcends these historical necessities, or these historical realities. Yeah.
Thanks, Safi. That's, yeah, Safi had a lot of great contributions I don't feel like I really did justice to in the summary.
Thank you. That's brilliant. There's so much to take away from that. I'm still sort of slightly processing it, and maybe can I come to Jennifer's group, and then we'll sort of open it up for a discussion of everyone.
Thank you, James. And I guess I'll summarise a little bit, and then if some people from my group want to also come in, they can, although Chloe's left, and as Tim said, she was one of our immortals. But thank you for making us read this, James, because it's such an amazing text. I think, you know, apart from all the other things, you know, the sort of concrete aspect of it, we were really thinking also about what it means for how to write and what to compare, and how that could sort of affect our critical practice. You know, what types of objects can you bring together? What type of comparisons can we make between them? And it's such a sort of, I guess he's a beautiful writer in that sense, and it does make you want to write. And the fact that you can have an essay that also has your own poetry in it, you know, and the fact that you can bring together Rembrandt and a photograph that is also, you know, it's just an amazing sort of, for comparative literature especially, I guess we were thinking it's a great text. So thank you for making us read that. We focused, I guess, mainly on the first and the last sort of, so on the story about the man who's looking for immortality, and then on the poem at the end, which is about the sort of the more political context. And we also started off with this question about if any of us wanted to be immortal, and I think, as some of the other groups have said, people found this not a particularly attractive idea, actually, which makes me wonder how we're meant to read that first story, because should we sort of sympathize with this poor boy who's going off? You know, do we partake in his quest? Do we think he's a fool? Do we think that it's the death coming as a kind of happy, like, it's a desirable end actually to that? So I don't know if we're really able to read that text in a way, because if you don't share that, it's kind of hard to understand really what he's looking for. And I don't know if it's an empathy, I guess I was thinking about with that first text, you know, why don't we empathize with him, and why don't we share his quest? And is that a factor of changing time, you know, in a different sense of the sort of, you know, the fact that that's a sort of medieval fable and we're in a very different world or something? Or is that the point of the tale, right, that, you know, that's not desirable and therefore it comes to an end, and so this is a happy ending? So we talked a lot about that, and also about different sort of mythologies have been, you know, that you were also mentioning this idea of lots of different myths of how to evade death, but how it also always comes in the end. I think there was a Harry Potter myth as well that someone can write in the chat, but you raised Harry Potter, so I'm afraid I'm not really very Harry Potter literate, but Isabella, you knew who that was. What was the Harry Potter myth? Are you still there, Isabella?
Yeah, it was Horcruxes. It was Voldemort like splits his soul into 7 pieces and different objects.
Yeah, great. So hopefully that means more to some people here than it does to me. But yeah, so I think we just sort of started with this idea that immortality wasn't very desirable. And then we started to think about what is the role of art and time then, which is kind of an odd one, because it's almost as if art is trying to give us immortality that we don't even want. And so we ended up in that kind of struggle there. You know, if not immortality, then longevity. And I guess that's what Berger seems to be saying, the fact that this, you know, for instance, for the painting, which we did talk about a bit, that it survives and it sort of preserves this moment. So it does seem like art is giving us immortality, even though we don't particularly want it. But we do want it in different forms, I guess, so not for ourselves, but for other things or for other objects. So yeah, and we thought, you know, that painting is very interesting precisely because it's a moment, but it's also repeated. And so we ended up talking a lot about repetition across these different, that was one of the things obviously that connects these different sort of stories and forms, is the idea of the sort of singular narration of it, or the singular representation of it, but also the repetition that goes on, which is also so classic in the kind of fairy tales or in the God Willing episode, or this idea of the same thing happening again and again, and whether there's any possibility of change or not. So we were talking about how would we sort of, what would we connect the start and the end? This is always a good idea, isn't it? Especially if you read it very quickly. For some of the people in my group, let's look at the start and the end. But how would you connect that story of the boy looking for immortality with his friend who dies in this political, you know, in the bomb, in the car attack, and what connects that? And I guess in a strange way, we were thinking both of them travel, actually, right? They sort of travel to evade death, but then death eventually catches up with them in quite a dramatic way that also involves the mode of travel. So that's kind of weird. That's what we found was weird about, you know, when you're being invited to compare these things that are different and actually incomparable, and there's a kind of almost, you know, shock of comparing them. So that's what we came up with that. What else were we going to say? Yeah, the poem at the end there, we also talked about those lines, not the line that Tim put in the chat, but the line about he will be here too in the spring, every spring, and about how to read that. And I think I'm definitely very sort of worried about it, whether it's a kind of utopian, messianic, you know, it really goes to this question of imagining better futures, right? Whether we're expecting his return and what that would mean, and whether it would be because there would be a different political, you know, be successful overthrowing of the regime, or, you know, what would it mean for him to come back? Or is it because he comes back in the poem? You know, so is it the poem that gives him this kind of longevity, or, you know, immortality, if we want to go back to that word? But is that also a kind of delusion, or, you know, that the poem is making this performative that is a promise that might actually fail? So we're quite worried about those lines. Spring took me right back to beginnings, though, for this welcome season, right, that we were singing this song about Dichterliebe and the wonderful month of May and spring and beginnings. So I thought it was a lovely, for me, it was a connection right back to beginnings at the start of this welcome season. So I think I'll probably leave it there. But we were very struck, as I said, by the sort of the question of what different forms were doing, you know, and how we could analyze them and compare them. So we really enjoyed reading that. I don't know if Isabella and Nanfan want to come in on anything. Chloe's left, which is a shame. But Isabella or Nanfan, do you want to add anything? I guess the other thing we mentioned was lockdown. I guess just to say that, you know, that question of like, what does time feel like during lockdown? Which I think you were alluding to at the start, right? But somehow with Zoom, and in some sense, I feel like we're very free in time. There were moments in the earlier lockdown where I didn't really know what day of the week it was, but when it's term time and lockdown, you have to know. And you also have this kind of Zoom thing that tells you 15 minutes to your next appointment or whatever. So yeah, it was quite a personal discussion we had, which was very nice.
Brilliant. So actually there's another, well, I think nearly everything that Berger wrote is worth reading, but there's a book he wrote in 1967 where he spent about 3 months shadowing a country GP, and he wrote this book just called A Fortunate Man, which sort of described his experience of going on the rounds with the doctor. And that one of the there's also some interesting passages about time in that book where he also describes the way in which he thinks that illness and suffering interferes with people's sense of temporality, in the way in which time can either slow down or speed up when we're ill. And I was thinking about those passages earlier in the year, in particular when there's that sort of earlier moment at the beginning of lockdown, or when we're about to go into lockdown, where time seems so strange, where there's just a sense that very bad things were happening and were going to continue happening, but nobody was sort of taking care of them. So there was a sense of strange vertigo that I had, of almost sort of standing on a precipice and seeing that the country was about to fall off it, but apparently nobody else, or the people who were supposed to have noticed, not having noticed it. And so that I think that's a really interesting set of reflections that people had about sort of time and lockdown. I would just say maybe a little bit in defense of the man who wanted to be immortal. I was interesting that in our group as well, nobody had any sympathy with him as well, but that it seems that so much of the way that modern medicine works and the way people think about sort of what a public health policy should be like is people think, well, are we increasing life expectancy, for example? And people think it's a good thing if people are living to 80 or 90 now rather than 50 or 60. And that it's an interesting thing to see why it is that we think, well, I guess nobody would want any of our parents or our children to die at the age of 50 if they could live to 80 or 90. And it's one thing to reflect on is, why is it that we're sure that as we want to have a decently long life now, but we don't think, well, it wouldn't be worth living to 200 or 300? Is it just that we're sort of a bit stuck in our ways? We can't sort of imagine what it would be like to have a much longer and a good life. It may be that just that insofar as a life is good, then our friends and our family need to be around us as well. So maybe one last thing to comment on, which I thought was fantastically interesting, is just, as it were, Berger as writer, that one of the things I do like about this text, and quite a lot of the texts that he produces later in his life, is just how sort of strangely sort of varied there are. That I don't think there's hardly anyone else who could get away with, as it were, this sort of essay which is composed of partly stories, partly traditional stories. Some of them he's made up, plus a bit of philosophy, plus some poetry. And somehow it sort of works and reflects on itself, and sort of that sort of variety of different modes of writing, which without sort of explicitly explaining how all the bits are supposed to relate to one another, makes it kind of rich and interesting. And maybe that's in a way that's part of maybe the medium is part of the message. If he wants us to have a variety of different ways of reflecting on time rather than just focusing down on a single one, then maybe to give us a number of different lenses for doing so, all within the same text, is one of the ways of showing us how to do that. I think that we officially have about 1 minute left. So the one thing I might do is just thank everybody for what's been a really interesting discussion. And well, thank you for reading the texts and enjoying it and contributing so brilliantly. And thanks to Jennifer and Natasha for facilitating so well. And that hopefully I'll see many, if not all of you, tomorrow, where we have the film club on the film Arrival. And one thing to say about the film club is that do watch the film beforehand, so that, as it were, we're going to start the discussion on the assumption that people have seen the film already. And of course, there's our final panel on Thursday. And well, thank you very much and good night.